Hey, Glenn.
Hey there, John McWhorter. Long time no talk to on Blogging Heads, John. Where you been?
Well, I've been buried in writing a book about language for the general public, and I have this laser focus on it, and so that is all I've been doing, but I'm coming up for air today.
I have one small request, John.
Sure.
Could you slow down the rate at which you write books so that people like me wouldn't have to be so depressed so much of the time?
I am only alive when I'm writing one, so I don't think I could slow down.
Damn,
I might start writing the same one over and over.
It feels like it's more than one book a year, John, is it? I mean, doggone.
It's about, I haven't written one in about 3, and I have not felt like quite a person, and boy, does it feel good to be doing it again, and after this one, I'm going to start another one. So, yeah, it's been fun. What are you doing lately?
You're one industrious fellow. Well, I've been teaching my classes, my students here, which I enjoy very much at Brown. And I've had some interesting experiences recently. For example, I was at Columbia University, your employer.
The other day.
The other day, responding to a very distinguished lecture by Eric Sundquist, who's a professor at the University of Chicago of English, on Ralph Ellison's unfinished last novel, Martin Luther King Jr., the Great Social Prophet, and Barack Obama, and we all know who he is. And Sundquist had drawn a line between King and Obama and had used his reading of Ellison's Invisible Man and of Ellison's fragments of the unfinished novel to try to support a kind of narrative there. And I was called in along with a distinguished professor of English to, Sundquist is not at Chicago, he's at UCLA, called in to respond to this lecture, which was, to me, a big deal. The Lionel Trilling Seminar at Columbia University. That used to be above my pay grade. I'm just an economist.
So I gather that
was fun.
So it was admitted that Ralph Ellison's late work was, shall we say, troubled, and I imagine that the thread of the conversation was that the rather tragic and poetic notion that he had of black identity had some sort of resonance for Barack Obama via Martin Luther King and his oratory and tragic hope and the like. I'm just improvising, but was that the general? Yeah,
well, that's in the ballpark, although it was not admitted. I mean, people were kind of gentle with an evaluation of the quality of Ellison's novel. It was only admitted after we got to the wine and, the off-the-record conversation.
Right.
Let's just face it. It's a really bad book.
It is.
Is what people were saying about Juneteenth. Let's just face it, it's a really bad book. Why so bad from a great writer? Why couldn't he finish the novel? Well, Professor Kenneth Warren, who's a professor of English at the University of Chicago, that's why I got them too confused. He was the other commentator. And he's written a definitive book on Ellison, and his theory is that basically Ellison was a product of his particular period in American history, which was the waning of the Jim Crow era.
Exactly.
And he just couldn't transcend it. And so things were moving so fast between 1954 and 1968. The ground was shifting underneath his feet, and yet as a aesthetic matter, as an artistic matter, he was kind of, trapped in amber.
He never knew what to do with what happened after about 1963.
Well, I think Warren would even make it earlier than that, but okay.
Right. I mean, as ideology started changing, and as notions of black identity started changing, Ellison,
and he had big problems with that.
No, he couldn't handle it, and so it's all very profound in terms of the notion of what an American is, that black Americans are human beings, that black Americans need to realize that they're human beings, but black pride, black oppositionalism, he just couldn't do it, and here he came up with this novel that was, written by somebody from a different era. It was a shame, and he never got past it. I wouldn't say it's a bad book, especially if it's whittled down some. I find it entertaining, relatively engrossing, but it doesn't have anything to say to anyone minted after a certain sepia-toned time. And it's a tragedy.
Well, I'm wondering why they asked me and they didn't ask you, but I think I know the answer to that. They already had their literary critics at the table. They wanted a social scientist to come in and say something about the politics of race and Barack Hussein Obama, and that was the role I filled in that discussion.
No one thinks I read novels. Nobody thinks I'm profound. I mean, you're the one who can do the oratory. They would invite you. I get invited to talk about things that are quote-unquote controversial. But I would have liked to have, Ben, I wanted to come by and see you at Columbia, but I was away.
Yeah, you were occupied, I gathered. I'm sorry about that.
But you know what, Glenn? Actually, it's interesting. The idea of your time passing you by. I'm in a funny place right now because I feel like it might be happening to me, and I'm not quite sure where to put this. And this is what I mean.
Wow, that's interesting, John. I'm listening.
This is something I've often said about people commenting on race who are of, shall we say, a certain age. I've always said, with all due understanding, that if I had been a teenager or in my 20s, in the 60s, and I had seen the racial order turn upside down, and I had felt the power of that, if I were somebody of the age of roughly Julian Bond, then as time went by, I've always felt I would have a very hard time letting go of the idea that the struggle was still the same as it was, that racism was still the same as it was, that as time goes by, you get kind of set. And I've always said that I'm the same way, that I have come of age in a time when racism was receding and it was a very new world, and that this is something that I would never let go of. I have often said, if for some reason racism started coming back,
you'd be out of it. That
I would become this old man or even middle-aged man, as I'm becoming now.
Watch out, John. I was born in 1948, man.
Sorry. And I've always said I would not change. It would be very hard for me to admit that things were different from the way they were in about, 1995 when my views set. And I'm beginning to worry that there may be that now. And it's because of this Tea Partier racism thing. And so we're being told now that part of what motivates these Tea Partiers, or maybe even the foundational motivation, is that there's this racism that's been capped, but now that we've got this black president...
John, hold on a minute, hold on. Before you get into the Tea Party thing, and we must go there, I just wanted to say something about what you'd said previously, which was being trapped in amber or, your time or whatever. Because, as you know, we're in this period, excuse me, in which people are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Yep.
And there's a conference here at Brown University that's being run by my colleagues in the Africana Studies Department, prominently Professor Corey Walker. Mm-hmm. And we've got people like Ivanhoe Donahue, excuse me, Robert Moses, the great figure.
He's in his 80s by now, isn't
he? He may be. I don't think he's quite that old, but he's up there.
Yeah, he's algebra now.
Yeah, the Algebra Project, and others who are on campus here at Brown, and there's an affair tonight and tomorrow. And I've been talking with my students, therefore, about what it all means. And 50 years ago for these kids who are 20 years old is a long time ago.
It's
now
another
they've heard
century.
of all this stuff,
right.
But the question is, does it mean anything to them?
Mm-hmm.
And they're searching around trying to find out. They're impressed by the idea that a student gets up from his comfortable suburban home in Scarsdale or whatever and goes down to North Carolina or Mississippi or some such place, sits in a segregated lunchroom or waiting room at a bus terminal, risks getting beaten up by the local gendarmes, and through the corporate effort of people of that kind, black, white, brown, and all in between, the country has changed.
Mm-hmm.
And my students, refuse to believe that they too couldn't have that kind of impact on the world. And I, for one, maybe because I'm trapped in amber of the 1960s myself, don't want to disabuse them of that idea. I don't want to tell them that was a special time, it has come, it has gone, and the capacity to make a change. And I'm not now giving an Obama campaign speech. I'm talking about what does a 22-year-old privileged person do with the great opportunities that they've been given if they have fire in their belly about social issues. So I don't know if I'm disagreeing or agreeing with you. I just want to say that although the times change, there's something about the existential imperative of engagement that is timeless.
Sure, there is. Incidentally, is Diane Nash from the old SNCC? Is she there?
I don't know, and I should. I'll have to look at the roster. Well, maybe, because they've made a real effort to bring in as many of those people as they could.
Well, of all the SNCC people, she for some reason doesn't get the credit she should. I think sexism may be a part of it. So if she is there, tell her that I said hello, even though she probably doesn't even know who I am. But in any case, the
Yeah, so
yeah,
on to the
I certainly think that the civil rights victories were a confluence of factors. I don't think that could be reproduced again. We're not going to have yet another time when you have the Cold War, where treatment of black people was something that the Soviet Union was taking advantage of as bad publicity. You're not going to have the novelty of television. We have such a greater mix of immigrants here. I do think that to create that is something that it would be rather quixotic to seek to do again. That's been my problem with the whole notion of a hip-hop revolution, etc. But the Tea Partier issue is interesting to me.
Okay, Tea Partier issue, and you say a racism, a kind of return to racism? Is that
are they? Yeah, are they racists? And I find myself trying to come up with a definition of what racism is, because I'm noticing that a lot of people I know, a lot of people I respect, are quite convinced that this is racism on the march, and that the current confluence of circumstances has brought an opportunity for these people to express their Archie Bunkerism again. And I feel like, am I in denial? Is it that I'm getting old and that I'm trapped in amber? Or is it that people are defining what racism is in a certain way that's more about self-validation and is more about showing that they know that racism still exists? Like, for example, I want to ask you this, Glenn. This is important. Let's say that there's some people in the Tea Party movement who, after the passage of the health care bill, use the word nigger with John Lewis.
Yeah.
Or whoever else. Let's say that they use that word, and apparently it's been hard to find it on YouTube, but let's assume that those words were used. There's no reason John Lewis would lie. Now here's the thing. It seems to me that, of course, it's repulsive that there would be people who would do that. But on the other hand, these are people who, for better or for worse, were extremely angry about the passage of the health care bill. And we can talk about whether that was appropriate, but they were extremely angry. And so they want to use some dirty names. So Bart Stupak gets called a baby killer. You can't call him a nigger because he's not black. It wouldn't make any kind of logical sense.
Yeah, I see where you're
going. Really mad at John Lewis. Now that you could call him an asshole, you could call him a bounder or a jackanapes or something like that, but what's the worst thing you can call a person who's black? Well, it's obvious what it is. Now, it seems to me that there's an idea that we're going to say that if you really want to cut someone to the quick, then if they're black, there's certain words that you're still not going to use. In other words, there's an idea that when it comes to black people, insult is always going to be polite. And I don't know if that's possible, but it seems to me that you can go for the jugular and call even John Lewis that word. And that doesn't mean that we're back in 1963 and that these people have a deep-set bias against black people and their concerns. Am I crazy?
Okay, so let me respond. First I want to say, if you say you're getting old, I'm leaving the room, okay? You're not getting old. I won't allow you to be getting old. Because the personal implications for me are too dire to contemplate. Secondly, I would distinguish between, I'm going to call it petty racism in analogy with petty apartheid, if you remember, that, and structural racism. And, of course...
Actually, I'm sitting here nodding, Glenn. What's petty apartheid?
Well, it's the kind of day-to-day... inconvenient and maybe even mildly humiliating, but not really life-diminishing code of etiquette in which the white supremacy ideology is reinforced through social practice. That's just my off-the-top-of-the-head definition.
Okay.
As distinct from, if you're black, you have to carry a passbook around, you can't travel to this part of the country, you have to only work in those jobs, and, we throw you in jail for speaking up.
Right.
So the petty as distinct from something really more vigorous, robust, and impositional on the quality of your life. Not that it's nothing, but that it's distinguishable from the thing. So now, we've got a lot of progress under our belts here on the structural barriers to African American participation in American society. Both in terms of laws, in terms of economic achievement. There's still big problems, and I imagine we'll be talking about some of those when we get around to the book on the Moynihan Report I think we're going to talk about later. But, no doubt that there's been a transformation. On the other hand, the idea, just as you say, that if a person gets mad at someone and he's, an Italian and you call him a wop, He's a Jew, and you call him what would be kike?
Kike is
I forget these things. I haven't used them.
That's so obsolete.
But you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
A Mick, if he's an Irishman or whatever it is. A nigger, if he's a black. You're angry with them. It's barroom lingo, and you use it. Now, I'm not going to say that's not racist.
Okay.
I just want to distinguish it from something, the Michael Richards, was that his name?
Yeah,
the comedian
Kramer,
who went off one day and started yelling nigger, nigger, nigger because somebody was heckling him from the floor of a nightclub somewhere.
Right, that's a perfect example.
I'm not going to say there's not racism in that. Sure there is.
Does it mean that he is a racist person? That this shows that he thinks black people are inferior?
Okay, so we're going to have to define a racist person.
But
because
I'm not
probably
sure
not in the sense in which people are throwing those kind of terms around, which, someone who is encumbered by all kinds of false stereotypes, who has a unreasoning disdain or, contempt for people in a racial group. Right. I don't know if that's true of Michael Richards or not, but I certainly don't learn that about him from hearing him say the word nigger.
Okay, so I'm not insane. You see what I mean?
No,
that it's a racist
I don't think you're insane. I don't think you're insane, but I don't envy you if you're prepared to stand up and say the Tea Partiers aren't racist when they're calling John Lewis a nigger.
Yeah, and you know something? This is the first time I've said anything about this. I didn't write about it. I didn't put it in the New Republic because I started to. And then I thought, when somebody calls John Lewis a nigger, it's not the time to split hairs.
But let me ask you a question about the Tea Party thing, because this is something that's been sticking in my mind for a while. So, okay, you mentioned people being called racist because of some of the signs and some of the intemperate language.
Yeah.
They're also called idiots because they don't believe it's said that Barack Obama was born in the country or he might not be a citizen.
Right.
They don't want the government putting its hands on their Social Security when Social Security is a government program, so on and so forth.
Right.
So they're idiots and they're racist. And the thought in my mind is, if I were a deep, long-thinking Tea Party movement building strategist, this would be a godsend to have the talking heads at MSNBC or in the op-ed pages of the places calling my people stupid and racist. Because they're not stupid, by and large, and they're not racist in the sense that you and I have just been discussing, by and large. And so to have the people with control over the high points of the cultural terrain who are dyed-in-the-wool left of center politically, to call them that just kind of reinforces their identity as estranged from those sites of cultural power and righteous in their indignation and their alienation from the government, which is not what you want if you're trying to minimize their political impact.
Exactly, and it's interesting because people...
So am I crazy, or are we shooting ourselves in the foot to a certain extent by laughing in these people's faces while they organize?
I have been thinking exactly that. And it seems to me that to the extent that there might be a certain anti-empiricism, the classic example being the woman who said, tell the government to keep its hands off of my Medicaid.
Yeah.
It seems to me that it's human to shut out the kinds of data that you don't want to hear, and it doesn't make you an idiot. For example, I may be shutting out the data that indicates that racism is on the march. I'm shutting it out because I seek coherence. It's the same way with these people. And also, there's the question that some of the, say, nattering nabobs are asking, which is, why are these people so upset about these rather arcane issues of small government and a health care bill that isn't even that radical? And the answer, it seems to me, would have to do with cable and the internet and the way it draws people together in a way that couldn't have happened 20 years ago. And it seems that in the same breath, people talk about what the internet can do, but then when all these people are standing out on the steps yelling and screaming in a way that they weren't before, then it must be because they're stupid, because they're idiots, because Barack Obama gives them a chance to be the racist they always wanted to be. And that only makes them feel more beleaguered, and it makes them feel more heroic, and it just kind of keeps things going. I think that we should listen to what these people are saying and see if we can learn something from it, and get past the notion that it's inherent to human beings who are angry to always be civil. And so, it's a fascinating phenomenon.
I have the feeling in terms of political organization that we've been here before. I'm thinking about the reaction, the kind of in the culture war context, the reaction of the moral majority, family research council, the Pat Robertson types, the sort of Christian right, the rise of the Christian right, reacting against what was a brief period of political and cultural hegemony for the countercultural left.
That was about 15 years, right?
Yeah, let's say, 65 to 80, I don't know how you label it, okay?
Yeah.
So, and yet, while that was going on, there was out there in the boonies, in the middle of the country, in the South, in the Bible Belt and so on, there was a reaction that was building, okay? And that reaction resulted in the creation of these organizations like the Moral Majority and the others. And in the consolidation of a political movement that took over and transformed the Republican Party, and that ultimately has run the table politically, if you ask me, on many of the most important social questions. They have had a tremendous impact, much bigger an impact on our politics than did the hegemonic countercultural movement of that 15-year period that we just got through referring to.
Very briefly, it can be argued that both you...
Are we living through that again? That was the bottom line on my...
Right. Yeah. I mean,
we're going to see that again. Obama for 8 years, but then if 8, and then something else very, very different for 28 years.
It seems to me that strain is going to keep coming back, that idea that we need to go back to a certain conception of an America that had a certain moral order. And people are always going to see overtones in it of wanting to put women back in the kitchen and colored people back in their place. And of course, there might be a strain of that in it. I mean, having worked with the Manhattan Institute, I've known quite a few Republicans, and most of them I have found are very much human beings, intelligent human beings like everyone else.
No.
But the occasional Republican, I have noticed, really, they do kind of wish it was still 1950, but it's by no means the majority. But the point is that it seems to me that way of looking at things is going to be not only cross-gender, but it's going to be cross-racial, even as we become a kind of majority-minority country. Like, for example, these Tyler Perry movies and these plays. It's interesting. This Medea, this Tyler Perry goes into drag playing this pistol-toting, pot-smoking grandmother who nevertheless lays down the line. And now I think they're on their 8th Tyler Perry movie, and they're these kind of pot boilers. They exist on the intellectual level, roughly, of Good Times. And they are good times. I mean, really, if you sit down and sit through one, it's hard not to have a good time. But they are as buttoned up morally, right down to advocating...
They're pretty Victorian, aren't they?
You don't have sex before marriage, or if you've already had sex, when you meet the right person, then you wait until you're married.
So what's with the pot-smoking grandmother? That's consistent with this button-up?
She's very interesting because she's the pot-smoking grandmother, and that gets the laughs. That kind of gets the audiences in their seats. And this started as a stage character. Tyler Perry takes these plays around the country. I've seen a couple of them live. It's a great experience. And then the grandmother, he sits down in a chair. Literally, in the plays, he sits down in a chair and he does 20 minutes of just giving very, very almost Victorian advice about not having children until you're married and all of the things.
This is before or after smoking the pot? This is what I'm
See, there's a kind of a contradiction. And to my knowledge, you never see her smoking the pot.
Do you remember the Alan Arkin character in Little Miss Sunshine?
Yes, the old man.
So it's not a black thing,
No,
grandparents smoking pot. It's a '60s thing.
No, and you barely ever see her actually using the gun. I can think of at one point where she actually fires the gun, and it's off stage.
But
it's interesting.
Got one.
But these Tyler Perry movies appeal partly. These are movies where everybody has an unquestioning faith in God, or if they don't, then they do by the end. All of that is very Jerry Falwell, really. It just has a different color and a different flavor. And so I think if we go forward 50 years, we are going to see people coming up with this idea that we need to go back to the old way, but there's going to be a flavor, as you might say to it, that we don't see now. Yeah, that's always going to be there. There are people who were making a kind of an argument like that way back in the Goldwater era. So yeah, I think we're stuck with that. It's gonna morph, but it's always gonna be there.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
So let's talk about something else.
Well, you keep saying Patterson book. What Patterson
Okay,
book?
So this is James Patterson. He's a professor emeritus of history at Brown University, I'm proud to say. A very distinguished American historian. social historian who has written big books, and he's won a Pulitzer Prize for one of his books. I don't remember the title of it offhand. And he also wrote a history of America's struggle against poverty that had a big influence on me when I read it in the early 1980s. As a, sort of looking way back through the various epochs of American social policy evolution at ways and attitudes and policies toward the poor. Mm-hmm. So what he's done is he's written now, it's about to be published. Both you and I have read it, and you've reviewed it for the New Republic, and I'm reviewing it for First Things. Mm-hmm. And I missed my deadline for the next issue. They're kind of mad at me down there, but I'm going to get it to them before. They're a monthly, thank God. So
what is that book called?
It's called... I'm looking on my shelf. Freedom is not enough.
Freedom isn't enough. That's right. Yeah.
Freedom is not enough. And it's a history of the Moynihan Report.
That's right.
Of 1965. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then a bureaucrat in the Department of Labor of the Lyndon Johnson administration. The famous report on the Negro family, as it was called in those days. The Case for National Action. That was the subtitle of Daniel Moynihan's report, and Patterson's book is about that report. So I've described and set up what the book is about. Maybe you can take over and offer a few thoughts as to what you think it accomplishes and where you think it comes up short. And I want to talk about this issue of the Moynihan report and stuff because I think it's still important in our time.
Sure. Patterson does kind of biography cum policy history of the Moynihan Report, and it's showing that family mores in the black community in the 60s were different from the dominant white ones and involved an alarming amount to Moynihan.
Illegitimacy was the difference. I'm sorry to interrupt, but...
Yeah, and his idea was to use this report as what he called a case for action. The idea being that something needed to be done about this illegitimacy because it wasn't good for children, it wasn't good for the community, and it was a problem that had started with... as a response to racism and disenfranchisement, but it had taken on a life of its own. There was now a cultural norm, and something needed to be done about it. And Moynihan was roasted by people on the left and even in the middle. One of his children was even refused a play date, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I saw that. They were worried about the safety of his family in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1967 or whatever.
Because the idea was that he must be saying that there's something inherently wrong or bestial about black people, when the fact is that W.E.B. Du Bois had said the same kinds of things about black people in Philadelphia at the turn of the last century. It wasn't exactly new, but Moynihan, unfortunately, had made the mistake of writing while white, so to speak. He wasn't supposed to say it. And so there was a massive controversy over it, which to an extent continues today, the notion of the racialization of poverty. And Patterson's basic idea seems to be that the reception of the book was such that we still haven't really figured out what to do about the problems with the black family because there's been so much mudslinging. I don't agree that the legacy of the Moynihan Report is that bleak or unclear. Do you?
I don't think it's excuse me. I don't think it's at all unclear. Moynihan in 1965 was sounding an alarm as he noticed that approximately 1/4 of African American babies born in a given year were being born to women who were not married, and that number was up from, I'm going to guess, roughly 10% at the end of World War II. Mm-hmm. So in a 2-decade period, you had a very sharp increase in the proportion of African American families who were children born out of wedlock, and the illegitimacy rate, if you will. And that rate, which had always been higher than the rate for whites, was now vastly higher. That is now being 1965. Okay, and he said, this is going to be a problem for equal opportunity for Negroes. Again, using the language of the time, because while we can change President Johnson the laws and eliminate discrimination, and we can lay online various human development, war on poverty type programs. The family is a really important part of the story of human development, and if it's not functioning well, as it seems not to be doing in some quarters of Negro society, then freedom is not going to be enough.
Exactly.
Okay? So that's what Moynihan was saying. And what he recommended, the case for national action, was massive employment programs for Negro men. Again, this is a recommendation of its time, a pre-feminist recommendation. Lay on extra shifts at the post office, have expanded work programs, employ these men. They will be marriageable. They will be able to sustain a family with their income, and you will have greater stability in the Negro family, and that will complement anything else you do to try to, bring African Americans fully into the...
In other words, very great society. Yeah, exactly.
So that's what Moynihan was saying, and as you just got through saying, he got hung out to dry. I mean, lynched would be the wrong word to use here.
Yeah.
But if Clarence Thomas could use it in 1991, Daniel Patrick Moynihan would have had a right to it in 1965.
Without a doubt. He
got strung up by, intellectually speaking,
burned
by people he accused burned in effigy, accused of being a racist, persona non grata for, he recovered, got elected to the Senate from New York, had a distinguished career. But the thing is, he was so... right, it's not even funny. I mean, this is one of the kind of social science prognostications, getting it right, one of the most amazing ones of all time, because the phenomenon that he identified in 1965 of a widening gap just continued to widen. And while it's true...
By the 90s, 75%.
Yeah, we're up to 2/3, 3/4, depending on how you count and where you look, of African-American children born to unmarried women. That is 2/3 to 3/4 illegitimacy rate as opposed to the alarming 25% in 1965. And you can't persuade me that does not have a deleterious consequence.
Yeah, for example, if I may interject, Isabel Sawhill and Christopher Jenks said a while ago now, very simply, that you will not be poor if you finish school, 2, get and keep a job, and 3, don't have children until you get married. Those 3 simple things mean that you will almost certainly not be poor, whether you are white, black, or polka-dotted. No one could disagree, no matter what their politics were. And Moynihan was basically playing into an equation of that kind that any human being would regard as sage advice. And yet, because he was the wrong color in saying it, he was shot at dawn. And a lot of people clearly hadn't read the report, because he makes it very clear within the text of the report that he knows why these problems happened before, and that what he wants is to do the betterment of the black community. But this is why I'm glad I missed the 60s, because that climate is so depressing to me that someone like him couldn't be heard just because of a new mood. But Patterson seems to think that nothing came out of the report because of that reception. And I wouldn't say that, because we're having this conversation now.
Yeah, and we've been having, not you and I, but people have been having this conversation for 20 years now, I think, about the Moynihan report. I mean, it's been being said, William Julius Wilson, the distinguished sociologist and a social democrat, a man on the left politically, but he's always, in his books, been making this point that social pathology and, behavioral problems amongst African Americans, while they have their historical explanation, are nevertheless, to some degree, had taken on a life of their own and have negative consequences for, bringing people along. But I wanted to say that I thought... So Patterson's book starts with Moynihan and spends most of its time there, but it brings the discussion on up through the 1990s and the welfare reform debates of those years and into our current decade and century with the leadership of Barack Obama, and in particular his outspoken comments, including his Father's Day speech in Chicago during the 2008 campaign, that that black fathers need to be more responsible, that some of what is wrong can't be fixed by social policy and requires the community to really change the way that people are behaving. And then there's also the ministry, I'll call it, of Bill Cosby, which we've talked about before, you and I, who's been on a tear talking about this stuff. So, the conversation has changed.
And go ahead.
Can I just make this point, and I'll try to be brief?
Sure.
The thing that I was most struck by, though, in Patterson's account, was the way in which Moynihan himself, but also President Johnson, reacted to these events of the 1960s. Johnson basically wrote off his ambition. Johnson in 1965 gave this amazing speech at Howard University in June, commencement address, where he basically said we have to have affirmative action. He didn't know exactly what that was at that time, but he meant, you just can't pass civil rights laws. You have to do stuff.
Yeah,
to empower.
The speech with the starting line.
Yeah,
quote.
It's unfair if you hobble them for generations to bring them to the starting line and equally and think that can be a fair race. It's not a fair race. This is what Johnson was saying.
And then Watts happened 10 minutes later.
Watts and the cities were burning. The political climate, the black radicalism, and then the cowardice and what's the word? Fecklessness of the sort of moderate black leadership who, with a few exceptions, rallied to this lynching of Moynihan and this kind of contemptuous dismissal of the facts. In other words, if the facts are that the Negro family, again using the language of the time, is in trouble, it would be helpful to take those facts on board, whatever your politics are. So Johnson concluded he wasn't dealing with serious people.
Yes.
And changed, of course, the Vietnam War also helped to change his priorities.
That distracted him too, yeah.
But we never got back to that moment, you see. And so the cost of the fecklessness and the cost of the politically correct, they ruled the stage for 5 or 10 years, but then history has its say.
Yeah.
The cost has been really quite substantial, I think, in terms of alienating potential political allies and forestalling the kind of conceptualization, the kind of careful intellectual work that would need to be done to actually deal with this problem. And here we are with, the black family in, very dire straits, I think one would have to say, and with the mood in terms of social policy having changed so dramatically in the country to the right.
Yeah, and, it's a chilling moment, actually, because I just read a book that is so very right. And I mean right as in correct, not Republican. And when you compare the book with what passes today for constructive commentary and planning on the black condition, it really chills you to the bone. It's a book by Amy Wax, who's a law professor at the University
of Pennsylvania.
She's an
iconoclast, I understand.
She is, and she is not black at all.
I noticed that.
And she's written a book called, I think, Race, Wrongs, and Remedies. And it's just 137 pages. It's a quick, mean little monograph, and it makes the very simple point that even if a truck driver has run someone over, and we know that it was the truck driver's fault. The pedestrian was looking, but the truck driver just ran over them. That if the pedestrian is going to learn to walk again, if they're going to learn to put one foot in front of the other, the truck driver cannot make them do it. The truck driver can pay their doctor bill. The truck driver can pay for the physical therapy. The truck driver cannot get into their nervous system and make them put forth the huge effort to learn to walk again. And that's not fair, but it's just true. And that is her analogy.
Okay, John, I just got to say this. I'm calling my lawyer because she's infringing on my copyright. I said the same thing 25 years ago. Okay, end of my intervention. Go ahead.
Really? Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, I use exactly the same analogy. It wasn't a truck driver. It was an automobile. But you get hit by a car.
Yeah.
It's their fault that your leg is broken, but you're the one that's got to stand up and walk.
You have to stand up. And so
if you're not going to get up, and that's on you, you're not going to walk.
They can't get into you. Yeah. And her point is that when it comes to racism in the past and what it's done to the black family and to the black anything else, the sad fact is that if there isn't a strong movement, even obsession within the black community towards doing the work itself, then nothing's going to happen. And I think what she means is to just let go of all governmental programs that help black people. And I don't know if we need to go that far, but
that's what she recommends?
She doesn't say it outright, but it's the implication. And I respect her for it because she's making a logical argument. But the fact of the matter is that whatever governmental programs there are can really only do so much, and that so much is probably nowhere near half. And it makes you think that unless there is an agreement that culture is something that we have to be as excited about as sniffing out evidence of racism, then nothing's going to happen. And then you look at things like Tavis Smiley calling a summit last month in Chicago where the idea is to hold Obama's feet to the fire about coming up with a black agenda. Yeah. And you look at how Bill Cosby is respected, but he's still thought of as controversial for making his point, and how there's still always a certain juice in the idea that white people are on the hook. To the extent that that remains a key element in the conversation, after reading Amy Wax's book, I can't help but think, is anything ever really going to happen until we realize that we are the pedestrians? Okay, let me ask you a question.
I don't know if Amy Wax is Jewish, and it doesn't matter, but the question I want to ask you has to do with being guilty of writing while white. Mm-hmm. And I want to use a Jewish analogy just to make the point. So, black people objected because Moynihan had an opinion about the structure of the black family. Mm-hmm. He was guilty of writing while white. Amy Wax, likewise, has got the nerve.
And you know what name she's been called sometimes.
To tell black people what they need to do.
Right.
And I'm just wondering how it would play if black people were to start writing books about, the crisis of identity in post-Zionist Judaism, or whatever the frame might be. If black people were to start having an opinion about whether or not the one-state solution or the two-state solution between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea was consistent with what Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King represented in the 20th century. If black people, etc. You see where I'm going?
Yeah.
If identity politics at the Hillel House got parsed on the same altar as identity politics at the Black House, and all I'm trying to say out there, Blogging Heads audience, is that the crime of writing while black is not obviously crazy. Mm-hmm. In other words, the sense of infringement when outsiders deign to lecture you about the most intimate, self-constituting aspects of your world, the sense of concern, of fear, and of anger comes from someplace, and it's something that probably other people share.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'm writing a book about language now.
I'm sorry, you're writing a book about what, John?
About language now, where I think about 5 pages are about the development of Hebrew. And I am writing these pages over and over because I can feel that no matter what I say, I'm going to get certain kinds of mail from people who have a sense that who am I to be writing about this? Because
and you understand, I'm only using the Jewish example as an example. It's not,
But yeah, it's definitely true. Ideally, we would want that feeling not to be there by people from within the community saying the same thing. But then look what happens when they do. And so I'm still trying to make some sort of sense out of what she's saying and whether it's grounds for advice and what it means about the race debate at this point. Sometimes I think that there is no real debate and that really we just have to wait for history to take its course. And that's rather depressing because what have we been doing for all of these years?
So you're reviewing the Wax book as well then for the New Republic?
Yes. I'm going to have a review of that in the New Republic at some point. Very important book. It came out last year, actually.
Do your reviews in the online edition of the magazine end up in the print version also?
No. And what we're talking about now is their new The Book feature. And so because the New Republic is mainly an online phenomenon at this point. So no, I doubt if this one would wind up in the printed edition. I'm not sure what determines that now, what winds up there. Sometimes I'll toss something off for them and they'll put it in the print edition.
Is Weasel Tear the gatekeeper on reviews in the online edition as well as in the print edition of the magazine?
My sense is that it's somewhat different. For example, there I don't work through him. I work through Isaac. Oh my God, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, and I email with him all the time. Isaac Chotiner. And so I think he's the gatekeeper there.
I see.
I think Leon is more in the print version, although maybe there's something that I don't know. But, yeah.
Okay, John, I got to go because I got to teach this afternoon.
Oh, yeah, that's something that people do.
Unfortunately, we've only begun to explore what we might be talking about. So, shall we do another Blogging Heads conversation sometime soon?
We should do this, and let's not wait months. Let's do another one in about 2.5 weeks. Because, we have more. There's some other stuff we didn't get to.
Part 2 coming.
Very good.
Take care, John. Good to talk
to you soon, Glenn. Bye.